In the previous chapter, we learned about the growing diversity in the colonies. And we also learned that in terms of diversity, we not only see ethnic diversity and diversity in immigration, we also see diversity in religion. The other important thing that we are starting to see develop in the colonies is many of these colonists who do consider themselves to be subjects of the crown are beginning to feel that they are not like their counterparts in England. And as a result of that, even though they follow British common law, they are starting to believe that it's okay to reject tenets of British law when the situation in their views warrants it. Specifically, we saw that develop at the end of chapter 4 with the Zinger case. And so that brings us to chapter 5, Wars and Empires. And we'll talk a little bit about the changes that we see taking place in terms of the people in the colonies and their ideas. Just to remind you of a couple of important concepts from earlier chapters, keep in mind that term chattel slavery, which meant that African slaves specifically were to be treated as movable property. This meant that they could be bought, sold, and traded as any other form of property. And this was very specific to African slaves as it did not include indentured servants. So picking up here with chapter 5, we have the opening battles of this French and Indian conflict. So the British really sought to attempt to protect the colonies from the French as well as the Indian allies of the French. And this was even before George Washington had lost Fort Necessity in 1754. Now, they were interested in an alliance with the Iroquois Confederacy, and the delegations from the two sides met in Albany, New York in June of 1754. Now, the British do consider the colonists to be their subjects, and as such, they are trying to protect these colonies, but not just because they care so much about the people. They don't want to lose the land and the foothold that they have here in North America. Now, the Iroquois have a delicate relationship with the British, and for the past 50 or 60 years, the Iroquois have been absorbing other smaller tribes into this larger confederacy, mostly as a means of, one, increasing their own power, but protecting these smaller native tribes. And some of those native tribes had initially had very good relationships with the French, the Spanish, or the English, and some of them had had very bad relationships. So the Iroquois Confederacy itself has become a very diverse group in which people are primarily united by the fact that they are native. Now, at this delegation in Albany, Benjamin Franklin's plan of union would establish a colonial council to negotiate and decide on issues of frontier defense, trade, and territorial expansion on terms that would be both acceptable to Indians as well as the colonists. Now, we know that the relationship between the colonists and the natives has been very fragile in terms of the fact that more and more settlers are coming to the New World and staying. Now, the Albany Congress created new colonial bonds, but it ultimately failed because the British government feared that the proposed council would actually undermine the British authority. So the British view this Albany Council as something that the colonists are leading, and they view that as a direct threat to their authority in the colonies. The Iroquois, along with other Indian tribes, gained leverage when various imperial powers fought for control of North America. The conflicts between European nations provided the Indians with the best chance for survival. Different tribes used different negotiation strategies. The Delaware, the Huron, the Miami, and the Shawnee nations allied with the French, hoping to stop the British invasions in the Ohio Valley. The Iroquois pretended to negotiate with the French, hoping to win concessions from the British. The Creek, the Choctaw, and the Cherokee nations negotiated alternately with the English, the French, and the Spanish. The British decided to send additional troops to America to halt the French and Indian intrusions. General Edward Braddock and two regiments arrived in 1755 to attempt to reclaim a small fort. Militia units engaged the French and Indian forces along New York and New England frontiers, but within months Braddock was killed in an ambush by the French and Indian forces. Now, when the French initially lost Fort Duquesne, they this fort, Fort Duquesne, is the French name. This area will be sort of reclaimed and redeveloped, and it will eventually become Fort Pitt. So keep that in mind as we move into the next chapter. Extensive trading networks and help from various Indian tribes gave the French an advantage in fighting a very long war. The French captured several forts and built another one on Lake Champlain and continued moving into British territory. British ineffectiveness led to numerous Indian raids on frontier British settlements. British defeats in North America encouraged other European nations. France and England officially declared war in 1756. Now, again, the fighting has been going on for about 2 years, but an official declaration of war is not issued until 1756. Austria, Russia, Sweden, Spain, and many German states allied with France. Portugal and Prussia sided with England. By 1757, battles had been fought for imperial possessions all over the world, and Britain appeared headed for defeat. William Pitt took over the British war effort in 1757 and refocused it on obtaining North American victories while letting Prussia protect British possessions in Europe. He recruited young and ambitious soldiers in North America. In 1758, the British began to gain the upper hand, and their colonial allies captured Louisburg on Cape Breton Island, Fort Duquesne, and Fort Frontenac on the St. Lawrence. Prussia was victorious in Europe, and Britain won India. In 1759, British General Geoffrey Amherst captured Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point on Lake Champlain, and General James Wolfe captured Quebec. This gave Britain control of Canada. Now, here we can see the various territories of the major players in this French and Indian War. And we can see that a lot of the different allies are very spread out across the globe. So while this French and Indian War is something that is sort of exclusively taking place in North America, there is significant conflict between the French and the British globally. We can see that in Europe here, we see large chunks of land, Russia, Sweden, Austria-Hungary, France, and Spain being allies. And then we also see Great Britain, Prussia, and Portugal. And so as we are seeing more and more nations becoming involved, we see that that spills over and impacts different parts of the globe. Here we can see the French and Indian War as it takes place in North America. Here we see the French claims to various territories, the British claims, this area here being the initial settlements. Here we have Spanish-controlled territories. Recall from the previous chapter, the French were moving into these areas much earlier, and they've sort of settled here. So that leaves various native groups here, kind of pressed between the English and the French, or if you will, between a rock and a hard place. And then as time moves on, we start to see that there are British claims being made on the other side of this territory, which is putting some pressure on the French. Here we can see that the French and Indian War is really being waged in other parts of the globe here in India. And even though the fighting isn't spread out across all of the territory, this is significant because it really demonstrates both the French and the English and their desire to colonize all parts of the globe. War is expensive, and it's expensive in terms of dollars as well as in terms of lives. The war dragged on for 3 more years until Britain opened peace negotiations. Britain agreed to give up some spoils of war in the 1763 Peace of Paris, but still came out the clear winner. Britain reclaimed India, North America east of the Mississippi, all of Canada, and some of the Caribbean islands. France gave Spain all of its North American holdings in the west of the Mississippi and in Louisiana. Spain ceded Florida to Britain in order to reclaim Cuba and the Philippines. The wars between 1754 and 1763 reshaped not only Europe but North America in terms of trade and alliances. But they failed to resolve the existing problems between the colonies and Britain, and instead they created many new problems. Britain's national debt doubled during the war, and the cost of administering the North American colonies increased dramatically. Britain needed to pay off debts, raise funds, and keep enough currency in circulation to expand trade. Also, the Peace of Paris ignored the Indian claims in North America. So many of these colonists are really emboldened by their experiences during the war, in which they were actually fighting for their homes. The British victory encouraged the colonists to move farther west into formerly French-controlled lands. This movement increased tensions between the southern and the western frontiers. The Cherokee Nation dissolved its trade agreement with South Carolina in 1759 in response to repeated incursions into their territory. They attacked the backcountry settlers in South Carolina and in Virginia until Amherst sent British troops into Cherokee territory in 1761 to stop the warfare. The soldiers sacked 15 villages, killed the inhabitants, and burned their crops. The British raids weakened the Cherokees, but the Indians' sporadic attacks on backcountry settlements deepened the resentment of the backcountry farmers against the colonial political elite, who rarely took the problems on the frontier seriously. The raids also fueled anger toward the Indians. When the British took control of the Ohio Valley, they made enemies of the local Indians by hunting on native lands, starving Indian villages, defrauding the natives, and ignoring the traditions of exchange. An Indian prophet named Neolin proclaimed that Indians had been corrupted by European contact and called them to return to their ancient traditions and reclaim their land. His visions inspired both the Ottawa leader, Pontiac, to act against the British. In 1763, Pontiac called a council of Ottawa, Potawatomi, and the Huron leaders. The goal was to garner support for attacks on the British. Pontiac's forces laid siege to Detroit and subsequently attacked Fort Pitt, formerly Fort Duquesne, and other British outposts, as well as settlements in Virginia and Pennsylvania. Violence along the frontier sparked resentment among the colonists and British troops. The colonists did not differentiate between friendly or hostile natives. In December of 1763, the Paxton Boys of West Pennsylvania attacked a small group of friendly Indians near Lancaster, Pennsylvania, killing 30, and then marched on to Philadelphia demanding support from the colonial authorities. Now, violence along the frontier had really sparked resentment among the colonists and the British troops. And this was not new resentment and frustration, but we start to see it develop in new ways with these Paxton Boys in western Pennsylvania. Although frontier violence does slowly die down, neither side is truly victorious. Pontiac and his supporters retreated. Benjamin Franklin negotiated a truce between the Pennsylvania authorities and the Paxton Boys, but many problems will continue. In October of 1763, the British Crown created a buffer between the colonists and the Indians by prohibiting settlement beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Now, this settlement is just a line that is drawn. The Proclamation Line of 1763 really angered and frustrated the ordinary farmers and the wealthy speculators like George Washington, who had hopes of expanding into the Ohio Valley after winning the war against the French. Now, this proclamation line, we'll go ahead and look at that proclamation line. The proclamation line here just draws sort of this arbitrary barrier between what is going to be considered land that is protected by the British and land that is sort of open frontier. Now, this seems logical and rational to the British because they are truly unable to protect colonists beyond that territory. But for the wealthy who saw land beyond this proclamation line as a way to increase their wealth and status, this is very frustrating. But importantly, for the ordinary farmers, for the poorer farmers, they view this land as a potential opportunity for them to obtain land and wealth as well. And so this is something that kind of unites the poor people as well as unites the wealthier people. Now, in addition to the tensions along the frontier, Conflicts between the landlords and the tenants over leasing policies in New York and New Jersey continued into the 1760s as pioneer settlers in the Carolinas and pioneer settlers in the Carolinas also began to clash with their landlords and speculators. So we start to see that with increasing diversity and increasing populations, we start to see more opportunities for conflict, more competition for the fewer resources that are available. Large estate owners in New York began raising the rents, and at the same time, they began to reduce the tenants' rights. This is taking place before the end of the French and Indian War. Small landowners and tenants challenged some of those claims, and the tenants began to assert that they owned land that they had been farming for years. They felt entitled to this land. In 1764, the King's Privy Council decided that the Green Mountains belonged to New York and not New Hampshire. When New York landlords tried to expand their dominance into the region, they came into conflict with the farmers that were already living there. Now, this is important. This King's Privy Council basically decides that a particular section of land, which has always been claimed by New Hampshire, actually now belongs to New York. Now, for the people who live here and farm here and consider themselves to live in New Hampshire, this is infuriating. But what's even more infuriating is that the landlords in New York begin to establish dominance and push back against these farmers. The New Hampshire farmers fought against the New York authorities, large landowners, and New York farmers who were trying to reclaim this land. Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys established their own government and refused to recognize New York authority. The Green Mountain Boys inspired an uprising in the Hudson Valley. A group of tenants, calling themselves levelers and led by William Prendergast, claimed that they owned the land that they farmed and ultimately refused to pay their landlord's rent. They petitioned the New York Assembly for redress, but the landlords refused to negotiate. So we see a lot of push and pull, a lot of conflict between the people who live in an area pushing back against what they perceive to be a distant authority, even though that distant authority is a state away or even in a larger city. Now, this is important because this is really indicative of this American fervor that will drive the revolution. Different groups in various colonies continued to use the same methods in seeking fair treatment by the elite. They were well organized, chose their targets wisely, and first petitioned the courts and colonial assemblies before creating their own governmental institutions. Attacks on property were a popular tactic for challenging those who were in authority. British agents impressed colonists in port cities when the Royal Navy needed sailors. Although the practice had been going on for decades by the time of the French and Indian War and affected primarily the poor, colonists of all classes began opposing this practice. Impressed sailors had a high mortality rate and received poor food and harsh treatment. Attempts at impressment were increasingly met with violence from entire communities. After the French and Indian War, riots erupted in major northern port cities as elite colonists joined with the poor in protesting impressment. Various colonial officials took a range of positions on the issue, with some seeking a compromise. Colonial officials who opposed impressment and those who advised compromise had to gain the support of the working classes. Those elites who opposed impressment could direct colonial anger toward British and away from themselves. When British officials decided to continue quartering troops in the colonies at colonial expense, the elites found another common cause with the lower and middling classes. Although the soldiers were supposed to be preventing Indian attacks, they served as reinforcements for customs officials and impressment agents. These common grievances created a sense of unity among the colonists as they began to oppose the British actions. The ability of the upper classes and those lower classes to come together on this issue is very important. Poor and wealthy colonists forged ties with each other as they joined in opposing the British over issues of Western expansion, impressment, and quartering troops. Those are the three issues that unite the classes. Those ties were localized in seaport cities or in certain frontier areas. To expand communication beyond these localized areas and to have a greater impact on British policies, colonists turned to techniques that were successful during the Great Awakening. By mid-century, new denominations continued to split off from traditional churches. Many endorsed the idea of complete spiritual equality. In the South, for example, separate Baptists converted thousands of ordinary farmers, poor whites, and slaves. The Methodists, the Dunkards, the Moravians, and the Quakers also attracted Southern adherents by preaching spiritual equality. They challenged the social order by integrating their worship services and outraging slave owners and other elites. Most converts to radical Protestant sects did not view the conversion as political, but others saw religion as a divisive force rather than a unifying one. However, as more and more colonists protested the British policies, the techniques of evangelical ministers could be used successfully to mobilize the populace. The Great Awakening had created new techniques of mass communication, and its criticism of corruption and luxury appealed to people throughout the colonies. The habit of criticizing elites and local officials for disregarding the needs of the poor in quest for an even greater amount of luxury items and conspicuous consumption transformed neatly into the critique of British officials who also loved luxury, conspicuous consumption, and spared little thought or compassion for the needs of the American colonists. The popular techniques of revivalism that had been so successful in promoting greater moral causes were now used to advance political goals. British efforts to exert tighter control over the colonies only helped to strengthen those intercolonial ties. For much of the 18th century, economic growth had encouraged Britain to largely ignore the smuggling and domestic manufacturing in the colonies because those activities did not significantly impact the British. Parliament did not interfere with many of the local decisions because communication was difficult, and as long as the colonies didn't stray too far, it was easier to let them make their own laws and sort of ignore them. Now, this benign or salutary neglect caused many of the colonists to see themselves as much more independent from Great Britain than they actually were. They saw smuggling, domestic manufacturing, freedom from impressment, and self-governance as rights, not privileges, and they objected strenuously when the British tried to assert greater control. King George III and his Prime Minister George Grenville believed that regaining stricter control over the colonies was not only proper but necessary. Britain faced an economic crisis, growing unemployment, and rising protests over new taxes. Grenville hoped that a stricter approach to the colonies would aid him in solving the matters at home. Britain was in debt, due in part to its participation in various 18th century wars, particularly the French and Indian War, and British subjects faced higher taxes to help defray those costs, though they really hadn't benefited from the wars in the American colonies in the same way that the colonists had actually benefited. Tighter control over the American colonies would reduce the cost of administering them, but imperial officials in America warned that there was a new rebellious spirit among the colonists that must be subdued. Parliament implemented a three-prong plan to bring the colonies under tighter control. First, it established a Board of Trade and began strict enforcement of the Navigation Acts. Now, the Navigation Acts have been in place for 100 years, but now, under this first prong, Britain will begin to very strictly enforce those Navigation Acts. Second, it extended the wartime policies into peacetime by keeping British troops in the colonies. Under the Quartering Act of 1765, the colonies were expected to house, feed, and supply the troops. The third and most important prong of this plan raised new tax revenues and put the colonies under tighter control. The Sugar Act of 1764 imposed new duties on sugar, coffee, wines, and other luxuries, but it also reduced the duty on imported molasses, which was a prime smuggling commodity in the colonies. Additional customs officials and a new Vice Admiralty Court was placed in the colonies to ensure that duties were collected. Now, the goal was to reduce the smuggling and to ensure that the Sugar Act raised money for the Crown. Parliament also passed a Currency Act, which prohibited the colonies from printing their own money. In sum, the laws required the colonists to pay more taxes to Great Britain at a time when the money supply in the colonies was drying up. Protests against the Sugar Act took the form of speeches, pamphlets, and petitions. Leaders of the protest in Massachusetts created committees of correspondence to spread information to other colonies. However, in spite of some attempts at coordination, protests were largely disorganized and ineffective. The Sugar Act, the Currency Act, and the Quartering Act increased anxiety in the colonies and marked the beginning of conflict between the colonists and Britain. Grenville's new plan was to impose a stamp tax. Stamp taxes had long been used in England and required a revenue stamp on all paper transactions, including contracts, newspapers, playing cards, and college diplomas. Grenville announced his intentions in 1764, and the act became law the next year in 1765. Grenville would appoint special tax collectors, and the money that was raised would remain in the colonies to provide for colonial defense. Grenville and many members of Parliament believed that this act was perfectly fair. The colonies paid very little in taxes, and the revenue raised would benefit the colonies directly. But the colonists objected to the Stamp Act for 3 reasons. First, the colonies were in the midst of a growing economic depression, rising unemployment, falling wages, and an increasing trade imbalance. And the Sugar, Currency, and Quartering Acts had made this situation worse. Second, the colonists saw the Stamp Act as an internal tax designed to control the internal administration of the colonies. It was a direct tax on the daily activities of the colonists rather than an indirect tax on trade. And third, the colonies were being taxed by a body in which they had no representation. Because Greenville announced the Stamp Act a year before its implementation, colonial protesters had time to coordinate their opposition. In cities, new organizations like the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty challenged the Stamp Act. Stamp distributors were harassed and attacked until they swore to never sell stamps again. The Virginia House of Burgesses was the first colonial assembly to formally protest the Stamp Act. The Virginia Resolves, which denounced taxation without representation, were reprinted in numerous colonial newspapers. The Massachusetts House sent a written protest to other colonial assemblies calling for a Congress in New York City in October of 1765 to discuss the Stamp Act. Popular protests became more frequent and more violent. In Boston, Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty leaders organized mass demonstrations. Adams drew on the rhetorical style of itinerant preachers to deliver a political message. The Sons of Liberty distributed anti-British materials and hung an effigy of Andrew Oliver, the Boston stamp collector, from a tree. Protesters calling for Oliver's resignation marched a mock corpse to the Boston Stamp Office before destroying the building. Oliver had left town, fortunately for him, before the crowd set fires outside of his home. Thomas Hutchinson, Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, and Oliver's brother-in-law only angered the crowd more as he tried to defuse the situation. The mob then destroyed some of Hutchinson's possessions, which they regarded to be examples of aristocratic excess. Violent protests against the Stamp Act spread from Newport, Rhode Island to Charleston, South Carolina. The protests were so widespread that by the time the Stamp Act formally took effect, not a single stamp agent remained in his position. The protesters directed their anger at sheriffs, judges, colonial officials, and stamp distributors. Any violence was first directed at the destruction of stamps and the stamp offices before the protesters turned to the property of the officials themselves. The protests demonstrated a lack of deference toward British authority and revealed the growing power of the non-elite colonists, many of whom took leadership roles in the demonstrations. The protests, however, were not rooted in class conflict because the elites and the non-elites joined together for the same goals. Although the colonial elites regarded themselves as the leaders of the protests, they refused to participate in actions that they deemed too radical. 27 delegates from 9 colonies attended the Stamp Act Congress in 1765. The delegates, most of whom were elite colonists, argued for the repeal of the Stamp Act, saying that taxation without representation was tyranny and a violation of colonial rights. Proclaiming their loyalty to the king, they nonetheless advocated a boycott of British goods and asked that the colonists refuse to pay the stamp tax. A key difference between the American colonists and the British centered on the definition of representation. The British promoted the concept of virtual representation. That is, members of Parliament represented the interests and views of everyone in the British Empire. The colonists believed that they could be represented in Parliament only by members whom they had directly elected. Now, this concept of virtual representation is very important because remember, the British Empire extends into India, into Africa, throughout Europe, and into the Americas. But the colonists view themselves as a separate group of people. And while still a part of the British Empire, they believe that no other corner of the empire can truly represent them unless it's a person or persons that they have directly elected from the colonies. Although the delegates to the Stamp Act Congress proclaimed their loyalty to the Crown, they were also developing a common American identity based on natural rights. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766 after British merchants complained that the boycotts were damaging their businesses. When news reached the colonies, the celebration included the ringing of church bells, fireworks, and musket salutes. The colonies hoped for better relationships with Great Britain moving forward. The widespread and effective Stamp Act protests convinced many colonists that parliamentary power was limited. Local leaders like Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry became known throughout the colonies. The Stamp Act crisis also empowered ordinary citizens and revealed the effectiveness of distributing the political broadsides, pamphlets, and handbills throughout the colonies. Few colonists believed that the Stamp Act protests would lead to a full rebellion against British rule. In fact, many elite colonists were so concerned that encouraging activism of the non-elite colonists could result in a revolt against authority of the colonial elites themselves. Most colonists, regardless of their social stratum, believed that the best course of action was to seek rights within the British Empire rather than to actually separate from the British Empire.